Wow, it's been a while, hasn't it? I want to start out with a great big thank you to Karen for giving me, I guess, what amounts to a 7-week sabbatical. That's not quite the way it started out. I was going to be gone for 2 weeks in January, going back to Unity Village, or 2 Sundays in January, going back to Unity Village for our mid-year meetings, and she decided she wanted to work with this book called Awakening Joy, and she liked it so much that she decided to do the whole series. So that was awesome. Gosh, what a path she took us all on, right? We started out in January. Remember, I guess she was up here or down there, dancing to James Brown. And then the following Sunday when I wasn't here, I guess she taught you all the happy dance, or actually the gratitude dance. Well, you're probably not going to get a lot of dancing out of me, but you never know. Stick around, you never know. It was really great. I had the opportunity to get caught up on a lot of different things, yard work and the honey-do list and things like that. But one of the things that I got caught up on was some reading. And as I was getting caught up on my reading, I came across this article. It was about a new book that was written by Diana Butler Bass, she's written 8 books on religion and culture. And this book, this new book that she's coming out with, is called The End of Church. Sounds kind of ominous. It gets your attention. And it's all about how, and I think a lot of us have heard about this, how membership and attendance in Catholic churches and mainline Protestant churches has been going like this, plunging downward for about the last 15 years. And I find these trends fascinating because it shows how quickly things are changing in this world of ours. For instance, 1999, they took a national survey where people were asked the question, do you consider yourself spiritual or religious? The results in 1999, 54% said that they were religious. Do you think that number would hold up today? Not a chance. Check this out. 2009, that number dropped to 9% of people who considered themselves religious. There's a shift going on, though. Here's what was happening. 2009, 9% said they were religious. 30% said that they were spiritual, which is where you've all probably heard this term. It seems to be everywhere. Spiritual, but not religious, right? They even have an acronym for it now. You'll see it, SBNR, spiritual, but not religious. Okay, so 30% said they were spiritual, but we've recently seen another trend. We've seen people who are really warming up to the idea, on this next slide, warming up to the idea that they are spiritual and religious. I don't know about you all, but I like the sound of that because it sounds more inclusive. It sounds more holistic. And Diana Butler Bass looked into it and she came up with this definition of what it means to be spiritual and religious. She says, spiritual and religious expresses a grassroots desire for new kinds of faith communities where institutional structures do not inhibit or impede one's relationship with God or neighbor. Americans are searching for churches and temples and synagogues and mosques that are not caught up in political intrigue, rigid rules and prohibitions, institutional maintenance, unresponsive authorities, and inflexible dogma, but instead offer pathways of life-giving spiritual experience, connection, meaning, vocation, and doing justice in the world. Wouldn't you like to belong to a community like that? Don't you wish you had something like that here in Auburn? I mean, it seems to me like people are looking for something that, I don't know, on the next slide here, something that, I think we missed one. Did we lose one? There we go. Looking for something like this, huh? How about a welcoming spiritual community with a positive message that teaches people of all ages and faiths how to thrive in a changing world so that we can co-create a world that works for all? You think that might fit the bill? Diana Butler Bass is probably not a unity person, but as I was reading her definition, I thought, well, sounds a lot like what we are striving for here. That's our mission and that's our vision put together. Get the institution out of the way, try to help people to have that experience that they can take out into the world to co-create a world that, well, Karen gets fined. Co-creating a world that works for all, which is about that idea of doing justice out in the world. And well, you know, people who attend a Unity Center, you quickly find out that we do not have a fixed creed. We don't have a statement of faith. We don't have a catechism that people are required to memorize and recite. And thank God there's no such thing in Unity as an office of orthodoxy, you know, where they go out into the field and make sure that the ministers and the spiritual teachers are towing the line and conforming to, I don't know, a particular agenda or things like that. We don't have anything like that. And yet, as unstructured as that might sound, it doesn't mean that anything goes. We have our own history. We have our own tradition that we draw on. We have our own teachings and things like that. But the big difference is that we study those things and we question them instead of taking them and carving them into stone and then bowing down to it like an idol. You know, Unity got its start back in the 1890s. And it was the vision of two people, a husband and wife team named Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. And they're a great example of the scientific principle that opposites attract. Because they couldn't have been more different from each other on a superficial basis. Myrtle grew up in civilized Ohio. She went to college and became a teacher. She was prim and proper. Charles, on the other hand, he grew up out on the wild frontier. He grew up on an Indian reservation. He never went to school. Everything that he learned was self-taught. But what brought them together and kept them together was that they were both spiritual rebels. And what they were rebelling against was the kind of religion that they saw around them back. And they were probably the first two people to be spiritual but not religious, because they looked at the religious institutions in the 1890s and all they saw were preachers who were teaching that people are worthless sinners, that God is out to get you, and that anyone who wasn't a Christian was going to hell. That's all they found. They wanted something different. They wanted something spiritual. They wanted something life-affirming that saw people as inherently good. But they didn't have too many alternatives. I guess maybe they could have become Unitarians back then, but they didn't want to give up their Christian heritage. They wanted to reclaim it. They wanted to revitalize that heritage. So they ended up taking an entirely different direction. And in 1891, Charles Fillmore chose the name Unity for this new movement. And the word is a great choice because unity means the quality of being united into one, which really fit perfectly with what Charles and Myrtle believed about God and about humankind, about the world, about the universe, the sense of oneness. The God of their experience wasn't this angry, vengeful guy in the sky. For the Fillmores, the word God was synonymous with spirit, or with the source of all that is. One power, one presence, all good, everywhere present. They define spirit as the divine energy that is constantly in the process of creating and expressing. Again, they were looking for that spiritual experience. Spiritual, but with a structure to it. Spiritual and religious. The religious aspect is the structure. You know, there are books for people to study. There are ideas that people can embrace, examine, study, play with, turn upside down, reject. There are places where people can go to meet with other like-minded people to talk about these things. So, even though we don't have a statement of faith, we don't have a set of dogmatic rules and statements that we have to follow, there are certain ideas and there are core values that we can identify that form the basis of what we do here. You know, it was just a little over 20 years ago that there was going to be an article published in Unity magazine. They wanted to summarize Unity teachings, and so they asked the great-granddaughter of Charles Fillmore, Connie Fillmore, to take on the task of going through all the different writings and things and coming up with a way to express the foundation and the core values of unity in a way that would fit into a magazine article. That's a heck of a task. Connie took it on, and this wasn't necessarily very popular because there were a lot of people who were afraid that what was going to come out of this was going to be a creed and a statement of faith. Well, what Connie came up with, I think, was brilliant. She came up with 5 basic principles. You've all heard of the 5 basic principles. They're only 20 or some years old, and Connie Fillmore was the one who came up with them for a Unity magazine article. She believes that these are the basis for what we teach. And this is the way that she originally worded the 5 principles. Number 1, God is absolute good everywhere present. 2, human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ Spirit within. Their very essence is of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. 3, human beings create their experiences by the activity of their thinking. Everything in the manifest realm has its beginning in thought. 4, prayer is creative thinking that heightens the connection with God-mind and therefore brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. And 5, knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, are not enough. A person must also live the truth that he or she knows. You've probably heard these expressed different ways. Go online, check out different Unity centers, and you're going to find different wording for these 5 principles. And yet, even though the words are often changed, the essence always seems to remain the same. Even though we don't treat our basic principles as a statement of faith or as a creed, it's been my experience that people who find us and stick around usually resonate with these principles at a very deep level in consciousness. And that's because they're all about experience. These principles are leading us to an experience. In Unity we say that whatever teaching is being advanced, whatever idea, whatever principle it happens to be, no one is required to accept it based on blind belief or a claim of invisible or supernatural authority. We're empowered to look for evidence. We're empowered to look for proof that a teaching or an idea or a principle is practical, which means that we can see it repeatedly and reliably working in the world in which we live, which means we can see it working in our lives. For instance, that first principle up there, that God is absolute good and everywhere present. Now, sometimes you will see that worded as one presence and one power, God the good, omnipotence. One presence and one power. So I take a look at my life and I ask myself the question, how often do I live life as if there is one presence and one power that is the source of all of my good? How often do I do that as opposed to looking at my bank account, my job, or other people as the source of my good? And what happens when I focus on things like my job or my bank account and I look at that as the source of my good, instead of focusing on the eternal oneness, the one presence and one power as the source of my good? When does my life seem to work better? When I'm focused on the one presence and one power, or when I'm focused on those things in my life that are constantly changing? Bank accounts can go up and can go down. One presence and one power is always there, ever present. Those are the kind of questions that the principles invite us to ask. And so what I want to do for the next 5 weeks, I want to work with the 5 principles, one on each Sunday. And the first thing I want to do is I want to see if they're still relevant, because 20 years doesn't seem that long, but boy, with the way our world is changing, 20 years is a long, long time. So I want to take a look at these and see, are they still relevant in the context of what we've learned and what we know today? We're going to test these principles against our experience and see what happens. And here's a few questions to think about. Take a look at the first principle. God is absolute good and everywhere present. Okay, then why do bad things happen? And why are there so many people in the world who are convinced that there is another entity, not one presence and one power, but there's one presence and one power, and there's another entity out there. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Could it be Satan, or the devil, or Beelzebub, or whatever you want to call it? Interesting question. Or how about this one? Our second principle. If everyone has that spark of divinity in them, then why are there so many people who are not behaving divinely? Why aren't people behaving more divinely? You know, when Karen and I were in school at Unity Institute, we had an instructor who didn't like the way this one was worded. She thought that the idea of a spark was too limited. And maybe some of you do too. So what do we do about that? I know, let's question it. Let's talk about it. Let's see what that means and find out what's meaningful and relevant in our lives about that. Our third principle. Sometimes people use the third principle to argue that we create our own reality. Is that true? Are we that powerful, or does this mean something else? Are my thoughts the cause of all the good and bad things that happen to me, or is it more complicated than that? Let's check it out. Our fourth principle uses the word prayer. Find 5 different people from 5 different faith traditions and ask them what prayer means, and you're going to get 5 different answers, okay? It means something a little bit different to everyone. And then, what are we to make of this recent study? And this has been about 5 or 6 years old now, maybe older than that. There was this study that showed that people who knew that they were being prayed for after surgery had more complications. That was a tough one to look at. So what does that mean? Does that mean that prayer doesn't work? Or is the problem our understanding of what prayer means and what it's supposed to accomplish? We're going to talk about that. Then we have our fifth principle. Knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, are not enough. We have to live the truth that we know. There's nothing too controversial here, I don't think. I mean, it means that we have to walk the talk, right? We have to get out into the world and walk the talk. But how do we strike a balance between introspection and action? How do we strike a balance between being and doing? You know, we've all heard about the power of now. I think somebody needs to write a book called The Power of Tomorrow, because, you know, the future is coming. It's coming to us. It's moving towards us. So what do we make of that? What do we make of that? And, you know, I'm going to spoil the ending here just a little bit for you all, in case you're worried about this, because I'm just going to let you know that everything still works. Okay, the principles are still good. They're still relevant as long as we're willing to go beyond the superficial meaning of the words that we use, because words can sometimes be a bit of a trap, and we have to be careful. We're going to find out that our principles are an excellent starting point. They're designed to point us in a certain direction. They're a jumping off point. It's like this old story that we get from Zen Buddhism. There's this Buddhist nun who seeks out the 6th patriarch of the Zen Buddhist tradition. This is in China. And she goes up to him and she says, I've been studying the Nirvana Sutra for years and years, and there are still some passages that I don't quite understand. Do you think you could explain them to me? And the master says, I'm sorry, but I can't read. If you can read the passages out for me, I'll see if I can help you understand them. And the nun, rather impertinently says, if you can't even read the words, how can you understand the truth behind them? And the master says, the truth and words are unrelated. The truth can be compared to the moon, and words can be compared to a finger. I can use my finger to point out the moon, but my finger is not the moon, and you don't need my finger to see the moon, now do you? The moral of the story? Language is merely a tool for pointing out the truth, a means to help us attain enlightenment, wisdom, whatever you want to call it. To mistake words for the truth is almost as ridiculous as mistaking a finger for the moon. And really what this comes down to, I've heard this summarized, it says that, you know, the master comes along The master points to the moon and the student worships the finger. We don't want to be that guy. We don't want to be the one worshiping the finger, right? So a principle, a teaching, an idea needs to be a living, breathing thing in order to lead to the truth. We don't want to get necessarily hung up on the word God, because that's got a lot of baggage for a lot of people. The word prayer, we don't want to get hung up on it. We want to look to the deeper meaning behind it and find out what the experience is of that and how it expresses in our lives. So these principles are meant to be dynamic. They invite us into this dynamic experience of truth and a living relationship with truth, and we're the ones who have to do the work. So I hope you'll accept the invitation, and we'll get started next week. See you then.